You are listening to Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report, Exception to the Rulers. I'm Amy Goodman. We are talking to Dr. Asaf Jurakovic, a nuclear scientist who was the chief of the Nuclear Sciences Division at the Armed Forces Radiobiology Research Institute, currently medical director of his own center, the Uranium Medical Research Center, which is an independent nonprofit that studies the effect of uranium contamination. Your group recently sent a team to Afghanistan. Now we're going to talk not about depleted uranium, although you can tell us if you found evidence of depleted uranium used in Afghanistan. We know it was used in Kosovo. The military was loath to admit this. It took them months. We know it has been used in Vieques, the same thing. It takes them years to admit that they use it, and then when they're finally forced to, they say it does not have medical effects and that it is harmful in terms of radioactivity. Now you're looking at some other you're looking at things other than depleted uranium in Afghanistan. Can you explain?
Well, we are talking not about political propaganda. We are talking about mathematical certainties. Mathematical certainty is that uranium isotopes, 3 of them being natural isotopes, do have capacity of causing somatic and genetic damage to the exposed people. This knowledge is not recent. We know it for 200 years, since the times of Dr. Gmelin at the University of Tübingen in Germany, sometimes odd 200 years ago. At that time, radioactivity was not known. Dr. Gmelin talked about most dangerous of all chemical substances that he studied being uranium isotopes. Now, 100 years later, at the end of the 19th century, when Dr. Becquerel discovered radioactivity in uranium, the era of nuclear time started dawning on the world. From that time, it was very well known that uranium isotopes do have capacity of causing malignant diseases, cancers, leukemia, and the scientists who were involved in that research, including Madame Marie Curie, including her daughter Irene, and the generations of scientists after them, died of the illnesses that were undoubtedly caused by the isotopes of uranium. Uranium isotopes, whether depleted or non-depleted, do have capacity of irradiating most radiosensitive cells in the body, and lucky cells are those who are dead. Unlucky cells are the ones which develop mutations and carcinogenic properties.
Can you explain the difference?
There are many skeptics.
Can you explain the difference between depleted uranium and why the military would use one or the other?
Well, depleted uranium is, as someone said before, very inexpensive. And it is a waste product of the enrichment process of uranium for the development of nuclear weapons or the rods for the use in the nuclear reactors. The only difference between non-depleted and depleted uranium is percentage of uranium-235, which is lower in depleted uranium. Now, because it is cheap and because it is very dense, having mass 1.7 times higher than lead, it has capacity to penetrate through any armor with high degree of efficiency. But side effect is release of radioactivity in the air in the form of radiosols, which people inhale, and by the inhalation they get access into the bloodstream, reaching the most radiosensitive cell populations in the body, including bone marrow, including cells of the intestine.
Now, this is an important, Dr. Jurakovic, this is an important point you're saying when you inhale it, because the Pentagon says that depleted uranium, for example, is not harmful to your health, saying that the danger is minor to minimal because alpha particles can't penetrate clothes and skin. That's different from inhaling it.
I'm sure people of Pentagon whom you mentioned are not scientists, and anyone who is non-scientist can take a chance of irresponsible statement. Pentagon spokesmen whom you quoted are definitely entirely wrong, because alpha particles indeed are harmless if they are applied to the surface of the body. Alpha particles can hardly penetrate the thickness of the skin or simple sheet of paper. But we are not talking about skin. Skin is not radiosensitive tissue of the body. We are talking about internal circulation of uranium isotopes who are alpha emitters, and in the vicinity of the cells which are highly sensitive to radiation, they can cause carcinogenic modifications of those cells and mutations that will cause subsequent effects that are disastrous for populations of the cells that have been exposed. Uranium contains alpha and beta and some gamma radiation, and alpha radiation is highly positively charged alpha particles. When they go through the tissue, they pull negatively charged electrons from the external shells of the atoms, making those atoms disintegrate and lose their structures, lose their place in the molecular binding, and tissue undergoes either death or modifications that are absolutely and undoubtedly harmful. And we are not talking about propaganda of anti-government or government circles. We are talking about objective, true mathematical certainty what will happen to the radiosensitive cells which do get in touch or in contact with the alpha particles of uranium isotope.
Dr. Jurakovic, can you talk about what is the evidence of the use of depleted uranium or other uranium weapons in Afghanistan? What have you found?
Our institute sent 2 teams for the field investigations of the uranium presence in Jalalabad, Mazar Sharif, Kabul, Tora Bora, and several other places in Afghanistan. Our members of the team brought several dozen samples of the water and soil from the craters and outside of the craters where the bombs fell. They also took biological specimens of Afghan civilians, particularly urines, and some of our samples have been analyzed so far. The other samples are waiting for analysis in very updated spectrometry laboratory in England. Our findings show that there is considerable presence of uranium isotopes in the urine of the civilians who present medically with a similar symptomatology as it was encountered in the Gulf War in 1991. Those samples astonished us, and we didn't actually believe them in the beginning when we received the numbers from the laboratories, because they simply defied any wildest imagination that we had on the basis of theoretical understanding of uranium in the human body. The concentration of uranium in the sick Afghan civilians was 100 to 400 times higher than in the normal controls. And our normal controls were absolutely non-exposed people from England and from some other places which had absolutely no exposure to any kind of isotopes of uranium. We asked scientists who are experts in geology to try to interpret these samples for us by any statement that may lead us to better understanding of the high level of uranium in those human beings.
You know,
geologists,
go ahead.
Geologists failed to understand it as well, because geological formation of the land in Afghanistan which was studied does not reveal any particularly high deposits of uranium before the bombing raids.
Dr. Jurakovic, the UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, just came out with a post-conflict assessment of environmental impact in Afghanistan following the U.S. bombing. It's very interesting because it's very devastating on other issues, saying that the conflict has brought about a collapse of local and national governments, destroyed infrastructure, hindered agricultural activity, and has caused massive problems. But when we asked Pekka Haavisto, chair of the task force that did this report on the devastating environment in Afghanistan, he said they did not test for depleted uranium because the Afghan government didn't ask them to test, and they do what the governments ask for, the U.S.-backed Afghan government. But right now we're joined on the telephone by Dr. Chris Busby. He has just put out a new report that raises the level of risk for people exposed to DU munitions, that looks at the levels of risk of people exposed to DU munitions. We've just reached him on a train. He gave the report in Brussels. He's headed to London. Can you very briefly, Dr. Busby, in the last minute that we have left, tell us the results of your report?
Hello?
Yes, can you tell us the results of your report, Dr. Busby, very briefly?
Yes, the report argues or develops a new model which shows that the risk from internal radiation from particles like depleted uranium particles is between 100 and 1,000 times greater.
Are you there? We'll try to get him on, but as Dr. Asaf Jurakovic, you've heard just at the preliminary words of Dr. Chris Busby, your response?
My response is very simple. Chris Busby is an outstanding scientist with impeccable record in the low-level radiation, and his statements have to be taken with absolute seriousness. He is totally correct in his statements that we just heard. We are dealing with probability of unforeseeable environmental catastrophe in Afghanistan, not only in the biosphere, contamination of the food chain, but also in the civilian population. And again, it is not hypothesis, it is a fact that has been proven by many independent scientific studies.
Dr. Jurakovic, we just got Dr. Busby back on, who's on that train from Brussels to London. Can you finish the sentence? Yes, we're there. Go ahead.
I'll just finish what I was saying. That this report underpins the idea that these materials are up to 1,000 times more dangerous than is presently believed on the basis of the ICRP and United Nations risk models. And so we're quite capable of understanding that there are increases in ill health in people in places like Iraq and Kosovo, and also in the veterans who are exposed to these materials, because they operate from inside the body and cause very large amounts of damage to cells which are local to the particles.
I want to bring one last person in this last minute, and it is Karen Parker, attorney in humanitarian law, who's been working with the UN Commission on Human Rights since 1996 around depleted uranium. Is it legal under international law? Karen Parker.
Hello. No, it is not legal. It's difficult for people to understand why it's illegal because there is no treaty. But weapons have to be evaluated prior to their use based on the existing rules in humanitarian law. Weapons have to be shown that they can be contained within the territory of the field of battle. They have to be capable of being controlled and eliminated when the war is over. They have to be humane. In other words, the way they kill can't be by lingering illnesses and gene destruction and cancer causing, and they can't unduly harm the environment. Depleted uranium and some of the other uranium or radiological weapons we are using can't pass that test.
On that note, I want to thank everyone for being with us. This is an ongoing discussion. Again, the Pentagon denies the ill effects of depleted uranium. I want to thank Karen Parker. I want to thank Dr. Asaf Jurakovic for agreeing to this interview, and Dr. Chris Busby, who's just released his report with the European Committee on Radiation Risk. He's the scientific secretary, a group of scientists and risk specialists within Europe who assess the risk of low-level radiation exposure. You can go to our website, democracynow.org. You can get a copy of today's show by calling 1-800-881-2359, 1-800-881-2359. Democracy Now! Produced by Chris Abrams, Mike Burke, Angie Karen, Anna Noguera, Alex Wolf, Mike DeFilippo, our engineer. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for listening.